Analysts reveal how Venezuela transformed from regional crisis into critical flashpoint between nuclear superpowers dramatically. Geopolitical chess match between Washington and Moscow found unexpected battlefield in troubled South American nation. Strategic importance of Venezuela extends far beyond its borders, influencing global balance of power significantly. Experts trace current tensions to decades of failed policies, ideological conflicts, and resource competition intensifying. Maduro regime struggling economically found lifeline in Russian support, transforming relationship into military alliance. Kremlin recognized opportunity to establish foothold in Western Hemisphere, challenging American dominance historically unchallenged. United States distracted by conflicts in Ukraine, Middle East and Asia allowed Russian influence to expand. Venezuela's geographic proximity to American mainland transforms abstract threats into immediate national security concerns. Analysts debate whether crisis represents genuine military threat or primarily political theater and posturing. Historical parallels to Cuban Missile Crisis emerge with similar dynamics of superpower confrontation in Americas. Understanding how Venezuela became flashpoint requires examining economic collapse, political radicalization, and geopolitical opportunism. Energy resources, particularly vast oil reserves, make Venezuela strategically valuable despite current economic dysfunction. Maduro regime facing internal opposition and international isolation desperately needed external patron for survival. Russia, seeking to challenge American hegemony, found willing partner sharing antipathy toward Western influence. Convergence of interests between Moscow and Caracas created conditions for deepening military cooperation, alarming Washington. Economic collapse of Venezuela created vacuum that Russia strategically exploited to gain unprecedented influence. Once prosperous nation possessing world's largest proven oil reserves descended into humanitarian catastrophe under socialist policies. Hyperinflation destroyed currency, making Bolivar worthless and impoverishing millions of Venezuelans almost overnight tragically. Mismanagement of state oil company PDVSA caused production to plummet from millions to hundreds of thousands daily. Economic sanctions imposed by United States and European allies further isolated Venezuela from international financial system. Maduro government, unable to access dollars or international markets, turned to alternative partners for survival. Russia provided economic lifeline through loans, debt restructuring, and purchases of Venezuelan oil despite sanctions. Chinese investments also kept regime afloat, but Beijing maintained more cautious approach, avoiding military entanglement. Economic dependence on Russia gave Moscow leverage to negotiate military cooperation agreements benefiting both parties. Venezuela, desperate for cash, accepted Russian weapons purchases and basing agreements on favorable terms to Kremlin. Arms deals nominally require payment, but Russia accepted oil and mining concessions as compensation creatively. Rosneft and other Russian energy companies acquired stakes in Venezuelan oil fields, gaining strategic resource access. Economic relationship laid foundation for deeper military cooperation that now threatens regional security balance dramatically. Analysts note that economic desperation makes Venezuela a pliable partner willing to accept terms independent nation might reject. Maduro regime views Russian support as essential for survival against internal opposition and external pressure. Economic crisis continues unabated, with millions fleeing, creating largest refugee crisis in Western Hemisphere historically. Political radicalization of Venezuelan government under Chavismo ideology facilitated alignment with Russia against West. Hugo Chavez initiated socialist revolution, challenging American influence in Latin America through 21st century socialism. Anti-imperialist rhetoric and nationalization of industries antagonized Washington, establishing confrontational relationship from beginning. Chavez cultivated relationships with adversaries of United States, including Russia, Iran, and Cuba strategically. After Chavez's death, Maduro continued and intensified anti-American policies, despite lacking predecessors' charisma and support. Contested elections and authoritarian crackdowns led to international condemnation and recognition of opposition leader as president. Maduro regime viewed by Washington as illegitimate dictatorship, while Russia recognizes it as sovereign government. Ideological kinship between authoritarian governments in Moscow and Caracas facilitated cooperation beyond mere pragmatism. Both regimes face Western sanctions and international isolation, creating common cause against perceived enemies. Venezuela became member of small club of nations willing to openly defy American pressure and support Russia. Recognition of Crimean annexation and support for Russian actions in Ukraine cemented partnership between regimes. Maduro government provides diplomatic cover for Russian actions in international forums like United Nations consistently. Russia reciprocates by vetoing UN resolutions critical of Venezuelan human rights abuses and democratic backsliding. Political alignment transformed relationship from opportunistic partnership into ideological alliance with military dimensions increasingly. Analysts note that shared grievances against Western liberal order bind Moscow and Caracas together powerfully. Authoritarian solidarity creates framework for cooperation that transcends traditional realist calculations of national interest alone. Military military cooperation between Russia and Venezuela escalated gradually before reaching current alarming levels, observers note. Initial arms sales under Chavez included fighters, helicopters, and small arms worth billions of dollars. Training agreements brought Russian military advisors to Venezuela, establishing institutional relationships between armed forces. Joint naval exercises in Caribbean demonstrated Russian capability to project power in American sphere of influence. Bomber flights by Russian Tu-160 strategic aircraft to Venezuela sent clear message about Moscow's global reach. Under Maduro, cooperation intensified with deployment of more sophisticated weapon systems, including air defense. S-300 and potentially S-400 anti-aircraft systems complicate any potential American military intervention dramatically. Modern Russian radars and electronic warfare systems provide Venezuela with surveillance capabilities targeting American installations. Presence of Russian military personnel now numbers hundreds or possibly thousands, according to intelligence estimates. Submarine visits by Russian nuclear and conventional vessels establish precedent for sustained naval presence in region. Analysts debate whether Russian presence is primarily symbolic or represents genuine operational capability for sustained operations. Logistics of maintaining forces thousands of miles from Russia present enormous challenges, limiting practical military value. However, symbolic value of Russian military presence in Americas is substantial for geopolitical signaling purposes. Venezuela serves as forward operating location, allowing Russia to project power and gather intelligence on American military. Electronic intelligence facilities intercept American communications, providing valuable strategic information to Moscow continuously. Military cooperation reached new level with deployment of mobile missile systems capable of striking American territory. Strategic calculations by Putin reveal deliberate policy of expanding Russian influence wherever American attention is distracted. Multipolar strategy seeks to challenge American hegemony by establishing presence in multiple theaters simultaneously globally. Ukraine conflict consumed American attention and resources, creating opportunities for expansion elsewhere relatively unopposed. Syria, Africa, and Latin America all saw increased Russian military and political engagement during same period. Venezuela offered particularly attractive opportunity due to proximity to United States and existing political relationships already established. Deploying advanced weapons to Venezuela forces Washington to divert attention and resources from priority theaters elsewhere. Second front in Western Hemisphere complicates American strategic planning, requiring military assets stationed closer to homeland. Putin calculates that overstretched America cannot respond effectively to challenges in multiple regions simultaneously without overextension. Domestic political divisions in United States reduce likelihood of unified and sustained response to provocations. War fatigue from Afghanistan and Iraq makes American public skeptical of new military commitments abroad. Russia can exploit American reluctance for military intervention, maintaining pressure without triggering direct confrontation catastrophically. Leverage created by Venezuelan crisis can be traded for concessions elsewhere, particularly regarding Ukraine and sanctions. Demonstration of Russian power projection capabilities signals to allies and adversaries that Moscow remains global player. Countering perceptions of Russian weakness after military setbacks in Ukraine requires visible demonstrations of strength elsewhere. Venezuela provides perfect venue for Russia to show it can still challenge American dominance in its own backyard. American response to Russian presence in Venezuela has been constrained by competing priorities and strategic limitations. Pentagon recognizes threat but lacks easy military options that don't risk catastrophic escalation with nuclear power. Direct military action against Russian installations would violate international law and potentially trigger Russian retaliation elsewhere. Economic sanctions already imposed on Venezuela are comprehensive, leaving few additional pressure points available to exploit. Military blockade would be act of war requiring sustained commitment that domestic politics might not support. Covert operations to remove Maduro risk failure and exposure, creating international embarrassment for United States. Supporting Venezuelan opposition militarily could lead to prolonged civil war with unpredictable regional consequences, destabilizing. Diplomatic pressure on Russia has limited effectiveness when Moscow sees Venezuela as strategic asset worth defending. NATO allies express concern but reluctant to become involved in hemispheric issue outside their geographic focus. Latin American allies are divided, with some supporting intervention and others defending non-intervention principles historically. Domestic political opposition questions whether Venezuela truly represents vital national security interest worth risking conflict. Some analysts argue situation is more about optics and prestige than genuine military threat to homeland. Others warn that complacency about Russian presence in Americas sets dangerous precedent for further expansion. Trump administration imposed maximum pressure through sanctions but avoided military confrontation despite hawkish rhetoric frequently. Biden administration inherited crisis without clear strategy for resolution that doesn't risk escalation or appear weak. Congressional authorization for military action would be difficult to obtain without clear provocation or attack. Regional implications of Venezuela crisis extend throughout Latin America, affecting stability and security of entire hemisphere. Colombia, sharing long border with Venezuela, faces spillover effects from refugee flows and criminal activity crossing borders. Bogota worries that conflict between superpowers on its doorstep could draw country into confrontation unwillingly. Brazil also borders Venezuela and hosts hundreds of thousands of refugees, straining social services and security. Brasilia historically champions non-intervention, but military presence on border increased in response to crisis escalating. Caribbean island nations economically dependent on Venezuelan oil face difficult choices between ideology and practical needs. Cuba maintains close relationship with Venezuela, but economically weakened, unable to provide significant material support. Nicaragua and Bolivia express solidarity with Caracas, but lack resources to meaningfully assist regime practically. Mexico, under current government, emphasizes non-intervention and dialogue, frustrating American expectations for regional solidarity. Lima group of nations opposed to Maduro lacks unity and effectiveness, with members pursuing contradictory policies. Organization of American states remains paralyzed and divided, unable to take collective action on crisis. Russian military presence in Venezuela violates spirit of Monroe Doctrine, though doctrine lacks legal standing internationally. Precedent of foreign military bases in Latin America accepted by United States could embolden other adversaries. China watching closely how crisis unfolds for lessons about American resolve and capacity to defend interests. Regional order established after Cold War based on American predominance is being challenged fundamentally and systematically. Humanitarian consequences of Venezuela crisis, often overshadowed by geopolitical chess match, deserve serious attention urgently. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled country, creating largest refugee crisis in Western Hemisphere surpassing Syria. Neighboring countries overwhelmed by refugees face enormous fiscal and social burdens, testing capacity and solidarity. Malnutrition and preventable diseases ravage population as healthcare system collapsed, completely leaving millions without care. Shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods result from economic mismanagement and corruption endemic to regime. Average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds due to insufficient food intake during worst years of crisis. Criminal gangs control large swaths of territory, operating with impunity as state institutions disintegrated progressively. Human rights organizations document torture, extrajudicial killings, and political persecution by security forces systematically. International humanitarian assistance is restricted by regime, fearing aid will benefit opposition or expose failures. Military confrontation would exponentially worsen humanitarian catastrophe, killing thousands and displacing millions more refugees. Infrastructure already devastated would be completely destroyed by modern warfare, leaving country uninhabitable for years. Reconstruction costs would run into hundreds of billions that international community unlikely to provide generously. Venezuelan people become pawns in geopolitical struggle between great powers without voice in their destiny. Children represent majority of refugees facing trauma, interrupted education, and uncertain futures, permanently scarred. International focus on military and political aspects often neglects human suffering of ordinary Venezuelans caught between. Potential pathways to de-escalation exist, but require political will from all parties, currently in short supply. Secret diplomatic channels remain open between Washington and Moscow, despite public tensions and rhetoric. Proposals circulate for negotiated settlement, trading Russian military withdrawal for sanctions relief and recognition of Maduro. However, Maduro regime unwilling to make political reforms demanded by opposition and international community. Opposition fragmented and weakened, unable to present unified alternative that could govern effectively if Maduro removed. Russia invested heavily in Venezuela politically and economically, making withdrawal without compensation politically costly domestically. United States faces domestic criticism if seen as capitulating to Russian pressure or legitimizing Maduro regime. Electoral solution requires free and fair elections that Maduro unlikely to permit, knowing he would lose. International mediation attempts by Norway, Mexico, and others failed due to fundamental incompatibility of positions. Power-sharing arrangements rejected by both Maduro, who wants total control, and opposition demanding his removal. Gradual normalization with partial sanctions relief for incremental reforms could provide face-saving exit for all parties. Venezuela's opposition to such compromises, preferring maximum pressure approach that hasn't succeeded in forcing change. Regional consensus necessary for effective pressure impossible to achieve given ideological divisions among governments. Time works against peaceful resolution as positions harden and populations become accustomed to confrontation. Window for negotiated settlement narrowing as military buildups and rhetoric create momentum toward confrontation tragically. In conclusion, Venezuela became Flashpoint through convergence of economic collapse, political radicalization, and geopolitical opportunism. Russian exploitation of Venezuelan desperation created military partnership threatening regional security and American interests directly. Geographic proximity transforms abstract geopolitical competition into immediate threat, requiring serious strategic response from Washington. However, American options are constrained by competing priorities, domestic politics, and risks of catastrophic escalation. Crisis represents broader challenge to post-Cold War order, where American predominance is increasingly contested. Russia, China, and other powers seeking to establish multipolar world view Venezuela as test case. Success of Russian strategy in Venezuela could embolden similar challenges elsewhere, multiplying threats to American interests. Failure would demonstrate limits of Russian power projection and deter future adventurism by adversaries. Stakes are high for all parties, making compromise difficult, but alternative of military confrontation unthinkable. Humanitarian catastrophe already unfolding would become exponentially worse, with armed conflict devastating entire region. International community has responsibility to pressure all parties toward negotiation before situation spirals beyond control. Venezuela demonstrates how local crises can rapidly escalate into global confrontations in interconnected world. Lessons from history about dangers of miscalculation during superpower confrontations must be remembered and applied. Prudent leadership requires stepping back from brinkmanship and finding diplomatic solutions, however imperfect or unsatisfying. Future historians will judge current generation by whether wisdom prevailed over pride and conflict was averted. Venezuela crisis is symptom of larger systemic tensions that require addressing beyond immediate tactical concerns. Building stable international order that accommodates multiple powers without constant crisis requires vision and compromise currently lacking.